In today's episode of the ImanWire Podcast.
If you just look at the early Muslim scholars as geniuses, you don't really appreciate the big picture. And the big picture is they didn't just work in silos by themselves. They worked as part of institutions. And you see that these systems of healing, what we call in Arabic, Daru Shifa, the centers of healing, or in Persian, the Maristan, right? The place where a sick person would go for healing. These institutions spread all across the Muslim world. So I always say, just like masajid spread and madaris spread, Maristan spread as well. They were in every single major metropolitan Muslim city. And they were places in which you get your medical care, but also places where you get your mental health care. And there was a spiritual element ingrained in that, mind, body, soul. And that was fascinating to me. For me, we really need this. We're missing this. This is the link that I feel is absolutely missing in modern medicine, modern psychiatry today.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the ImanWire Podcast. Salim here. With me on the podcast is my co-host Shad.
Assalamu alaikum. Salim, it's good seeing you again.
Good seeing you. How are you?
Not bad. It's been a minute, man. Since
I know.
We've had one of these.
We actually feel like we say that every time.
Every time we get together.
But whenever I feel like whenever we do a podcast together, we have a very special guest. And today, alhamdulillah, we have Dr. and Sheikh Rania Awaad. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Very happy to have you here. We're really excited to discuss first about your book. You're one of the co-authors of a book called Maristans in Islamic Psychology, a historical model for modern implementation.
That's right.
And before we can get into some of the parts of the book, if you could start off the conversation, because we want to talk about mental health in the Muslim community. If you could start off the conversation here. Core principles our audience needs to be aware of in terms of how mental health is understood or represented in the Qur'an and the Sunnah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be very honest, this has been a bit of a journey in my case, in that growing up, I really did think that there was a connection between the two. Never really heard of a connection, certainly not from many of our teachers, from the khutbahs and so on. And it took a while to kind of come to this point. But once you open up the Qur'an and look at it from a psychological lens, the Qur'an is filled with human psychology. I mean, there's so much of it when you look at it from that perspective, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes human behavior to the T, kind of explains actually what we're probably going to do, and then also antidotes to, cleanse ourselves, heal ourselves. There's descriptions in the Qur'an where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking about if something is taken away from us or we are, tested in some way, we sit there and we make dua and, really cry and to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as soon as that issue passes, we make believe like nothing, just go on our life again, like nothing's ever happened. It's right there in the Qur'an. And that is so directly describing human psychology. In the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was sent as a teacher, as a guide, as a messenger for the people around him, and then for all of us. But I think about how there's Sahaba and Sahabiyats, and how they are there because they are humans like you and I, best of humans, yes, best of generations, but human. And so they're going to do all the human mistakes and behaviors and things that the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, won't do. But he's there to teach them how to overcome some of those human behaviors. And there's so much in his hadith, in the hadith narrations that talk about exactly that point. So really, it depends how you look at it. Then suddenly you start to see all the psychology kind of emerging.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of specifically about mental health, it's interesting, even one of the maqasid of the objectives of the Shariah speaks about the, preservation of the mind.
Yes.
If you could sort of explore that a little bit.
Yes. One of our, as you mentioned, the maqasid of the Shariah, one of our core principles or foundations of Islam, there are certain ones in which we talk about preservation of, such as preservation of life, preservation of lineage, and preservation of intellect. And that is powerful because then it means that was the cue. We talk about the inspirations as to why the early Muslims spent so much time studying human psychology, what they called ilm-nafs, the science of the self or behavioral inclinations. The reason they spent so much time is because of this main foundational principle. If you see someone in the society around you who's not doing well intellectually, and there is some harm coming to them or to the society, you must intervene. There has to be ways in which we help heal and treat those conditions. So they didn't see mental health as being a foreign thing. They actually saw it as one of the main aspects of healing and work that needs to happen in the early Muslim societies.
One of the observations that I benefited from in the review of some of these concepts in the Qur'an and Sunnah was the Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he's speaking about those who are excluded from obligations, right, of legal obligations, and one of them is the Majnun, right? But with the language that the Majnun until they're cured. That's right. So that you pointed out in the book how there's an element here that is critical. It indicates that this is potentially a temporary state, and there's a cure to it. And also, even I think you could imply that it's also not an identity either.
That's right.
It doesn't define you.
Right. That's absolutely right. And there are multiple narrations. When you read the works of the early scholars, which is what I started doing when I went to my training in psychiatry, I went in kind of very last minute, not sure I was going into this field, and it was very suspicious of the field, to be very honest with you. And then started to, pull from our Turath, reading, of course, from that perspective of the Qur'an and the Sunnah, also pulling from the early Muslim scholars. It is amazing how many of them refer back to certain narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, like the one that says, لِكُلِّ دَاءٍ دَوَاء, for every illness there is a treatment. Or the one that, where a Bedouin comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he asks him, Ya Rasulullah, if I were to get ill, should I get treatment? Now, the Prophet isn't a physician, so why is he asking him this specific question? What's the between, if you read between the lines, kind of like what was intended by this question? And you might think, oh, he's the Prophet, maybe he'll tell him to pray or make dua or something like this if you're not doing well. But instead, he actually says to him, na'am, like, yes, seek out treatment. And then he says to everybody, he says, Ya ibadallah, O servants of Allah, tadawu, seek out treatment. فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَمْ يَضَعْ دَاءً إِلَّا وَوَضَعَ لَهُ شِفَاءً. That Allah is not going to send down an illness unless he sends down a treatment. In some narrations, it says, a cure. And so the shifa or the dawa, either one of them, the point is the early Muslim scholars took that, ran with it and said, okay, we see an illness in society in front of us. We must figure out how to treat it. And mental health was no exception to that rule.
I always thought it was interesting, not from a mental health standpoint, but actually more from a physical standpoint, how there were people that were, for instance, blind or deaf. It wasn't seen as a disability.
Yes.
And I thought that was very interesting in our tradition, that these were oftentimes just a character trait, and it was accepted as such, and people kind of lived with it and moved on. And it wasn't seen as like, there's something, that's disabling this individual. It was just they are enabled differently than others might be. So I wonder if there's a perspective of that also when it comes to mental health around this is, we should all in some ways be treating our mental health.
Absolutely.
Right. We all need to be kind of on that path of, making sure that we're mentally healthy.
That's right. And that goes back to the usul, right? The kind of the foundational principles. And if you are not feeling yourself healthy and well in that space or sense, then yes, it's incumbent on us to seek out that kind of treatment and support.
So, Sheikha, you're trained in the Islamic sciences, but as I'm sure a lot of our listeners know that you're also a doctor, you're a psychiatry, you practice. There's one statistic that was given, in 2020, that over half the people in the United States who have mental illness are not getting treatment, right? So there's definitely a crisis both in and outside the Muslim community. I do think that there is some evolving awareness in the Muslim community about mental health.
Yes.
But still, there's room to go. But what was it that really pushed you to explore this historical reality of the Maristan? Was it purely out of historical interest, or what drove you to really explore this as deeply, so much that you wanted to really go deep into it and even write a book about it? Yeah,
SubhanAllah, this is where, because I refer sometimes to myself as this accidental psychiatrist. I didn't plan to do this, SubhanAllah. There's no accident by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, but for me, it was not really in the cards until, it became really clear that, our community needed more people that were grounded deen-wise to then enter into this space, because it is really a bit of the wild, wild west, as in to say anything can be mental health, and you can get recommendations that are sort of not grounded in the deen either. And so it could be a dangerous space, but an important space. So how do you bridge all of that? So when I entered into my training at Stanford, I matched in psychiatry there. And I remember my first few weeks and I was like, I need to figure out what this connection with this, like, what am I doing here? And I ended up going to the libraries, just spending time in the Stanford libraries, digging out the historical texts. This is kind of how it starts. And the first few people that I come across and eventually became some of the first few papers I written were on individuals. So Al-Balkhi is probably one of the more common people that I've written, a lot about. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi is in the 9th century, but there was also the writings of Ibn Sina and Al-Razi and some of the others. And as I was reading these, I mean, it's so amazing, actually. I'll just say very quickly, the way they write their medical textbooks is they write from the head to the toes.
Okay.
So very quickly, you can see a lot of the psychological discussions coming up.
Okay.
Wow.
And I was like, wow, there really is a connection here. And then those narrations and going back to the hadith I was referring to that they cite. And then the interesting thing is some time went forward in which I was writing these early papers that then became the beginnings of my lab, the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology Lab at Stanford. And at some point in the midst of all that, I said to myself, look, it can't just be that we have all these geniuses, because people started to say that, oh, Balkhi was a genius. And he was.
Right.
Even my mentor, Dr. Malik Badri, rahimahullah, would call him the precocious genius, because he was like way ahead of his time. But if you just look at the early Muslim scholars as geniuses, you don't really appreciate the big picture. And the big picture is they didn't just work in silos by themselves. They worked as part of institutions. You take Al-Razi, for example, who's Balkhi's student, right? He's a student, and he is given by the Khalifa of Baghdad, who basically commands him to build a hospital in Baghdad. And Razi becomes really important because he does all the physical health, but he also does mental health. And that's what he becomes very famous for. But the hospital, so interesting, the Maristan that he builds, there's this great story about him that we published about him that's actually in the Harvard Review of Psychiatry now, where he takes, just showing you the ihsaan, kind of like that real excellence in, knowing that you are doing this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He takes pieces of raw meat and puts them in different parts of Baghdad, and then goes very scientifically, right? Goes every day to check on the meat. And he's kind of writing down what's happening. And then he figures out the place in which the meat becomes rotten the fastest has the worst air quality. And the place where the meat is the freshest after many days has the best air quality. And that's where he builds the Maristan, the hospital.
Right.
And it's phenomenal. You just see how much intentionality they have into this. And you see that these systems of healing, what we call in Arabic, Daru Shifa, the centers of healing, or in Persian, the Maristan, right? The place where a sick person would go for healing. These institutions spread all across the Muslim world. So I always say, just like Masajid spread and Madaris spread, Maristan spread as well. They were in every single major metropolitan Muslim city. And they were places in which you get your medical care, but also places where you get your mental health care. And there was a spiritual element ingrained in that, mind, body, soul. And that was fascinating to me. For me, that was, we really need this. We're missing this. This is the link that I feel is absolutely missing in modern medicine, modern psychiatry today.
Yeah, I was going to ask around that. How different was it, given your training and seeing kind of how, I guess, in the secular West, psychology itself is approached, and then seeing this whole other aspect to it in our tradition? Was it jarring, or was it like, hey, does it just make more sense now? I kind of wonder how. I mean, I'd really be interested in what your colleagues that haven't studied that, what they would think. Yeah,
it's an interesting thing. From the time I entered the field until now, there's been such a shift from where we were, where there wasn't even room to talk about spirituality, religion, God. I mean, it's such a secular field, Western modern psychology and psychiatry. But over time, and I think something with the pandemic definitely contributed to this, where there was just more willingness to bring in other ways of healing, kind of holistic care. So now in medicine, like at Stanford, you see there's, and every, top-notch kind of medical system, you'll see this discussion on, precision medicine and what they used to call complementary and alternative medicine, CAM. Now they're referring to it as, holistic ways of healing. They've brought in what they used to think was fluffy and not really scientifically oriented, and started to study them and find out actually there could be a lot of use here. And I'm talking about things like, now this is the first year Stanford opens up a yoga clinic within our department of psychiatry, right?
Wow.
Yoga would have been something like, oh, that's nice, go do that. Now they've figured out there's some grounding, breathing, meditating that actually is useful. And I'm not proposing this because I actually think Muslims have their own indigenous ways of healing instead of borrowing from other traditions that may have some issues with what we believe in Islamically. But nevertheless, just to show some of what used to be fluffy in psychiatry and medicine has become mainstream now. So the field is itself shifting. My colleagues are more open to the concept of holistic care. They realize as much as you throw pills And as much as you do talk therapy, there's still something that's not fully healing the person in front of you.
In terms of just the institution of the Maristan itself, I mean, you mentioned that it spanned like multiple regions, right?
Yes.
But yet, interestingly, they all had these similar reasons for being instituted, similar methodologies, right? But what really went into establishing them from the ground in terms of financially and in terms of just, organizationally, because it was a very unique way in which they were established.
It was. You're absolutely right. And this is what's so interesting. It's kind of like when I say about to bring it closer to people's minds, if you go to a Muslim majority country and you've never been there before, it's your first time, and you enter one of the masajid, a mosque, you know what to do. As in to say, like, even if you've never been there before, even if they don't speak your language, not same culture, you know when you enter in where to find the mihrab and the qibla, you know where to stand for lines to pray, you know what to do in that space and function. The Maristans were similar. This is so interesting that they were the same type of institution was found throughout the Muslim world, whether we're talking about, West Africa, North Africa, into today's MENA region, up into Europe, everywhere Islam spread, South Asia, like wherever Islam went, these Maristans went with it. And the unique thing, there were unique features, like the architecture might be influenced by a specific region, the colors, the so on, but the content of what's inside of it is almost always the same. And this is over time and space, as in to say, not geographically, but also time periods. You get the first of these showing up around the 7th century. Definitely by the 8th century, we're bringing mental health into the discussion. Psychiatric care, medicalized psychiatric care, and spanning all through the end of the Ottoman Empire, right? So the main standing ones today, if people ever want to visit them, they're still in Turkey because they are, that's like, the last of the Ottoman Empire was there. And so when you think about where are they still standing, Turkey today, in Syria, inshallah, people are able to still go visit now that it's a free and open country, alhamdulillah. There is in Cairo, and also in Spain are some of the ones you can visit today. And a lot of them are now as museums, right? Kind of like set up as museums. But if you look at how it is that they all funded themselves, they had again, same process. It was all done with the Awqaf, the endowments. And the endowments, this is a waqf lillahi ta'ala. It's for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So once a person takes the money out of their pocket and says, this is for Allah, it's not theirs anymore. So it's not owned by anybody. These are done for the sake of Allah. But it's definitely sponsored by either wealthy individuals or rulers of that land who they always are very clear to say they took it out of their own pockets, not the country's, not Beit al-Mal. But there could also be monies that are coming out of the zakat funds, because there might be zakat eligible individuals part of these institutions as well.
Some of the shared features that you describe, number one, as you described, like in how they're established through the Awqaf, but also, is there something that for you that explains how these features were so ubiquitous in all of these different places of these Maristans, right? Where did that come from? I mean, it's not like they were communicating, hundreds and thousands of miles away. Where did that come from?
Yeah, and not always. Sometimes they were. Sometimes there were people who were traveling. We have stories actually where they were traveling, from Syria to Baghdad, for example, and fell ill, and they went to the one in Baghdad, and they were so amazed by it, and so therefore they made one in their country. So there is a little bit of exchange there, yes. But at the same time, it really goes to answer your question. It goes back to the original motivations that come from within the deen. The concept of healing mind, body, soul together is from within the deen. So if you're going to have a healing center, right, a Dar al-Shifa healing center, a Maristan, then you're going to make sure that it's not just physical care that's happening there. There's also the emotional layer. There's also the spiritual layer. And that shows in the healers that are, basically paid to be working in that. So it's not just physicians and nurses. They're definitely there. But then you also have the people who are doing what today we might call like social work.
Yes.
Because they're doing the, whatever affairs of the patient within the hospital and after discharge. You also have a dietitian and nutritionist, because food is healing. Food can heal you or harm you.
Right.
You have pharmacists on site.
Right.
And usually pharmacies, and they're compounding different medications and things on site as well. In fact, they're growing a lot of the herbs and treatments that they need in their gardens themselves and then using them. So almost all the Maristans had a pharmacy on site. And then you also have the spiritual leader, who today you might call the most closest thing it comes to is like a hospital chaplain.
Right.
And this team would rotate together. They worked together and they would rotate together on each patient in the hospital, right, in the Maristan. So that way you got the mind, body, soul element. And this is why you could see it kind of moving from region to region, country to country, because it's the same source of Islam that's fueling all of this.
Yeah, so the ethos of Islam is informing their approach.
Absolutely.
And that probably also applies to the location, the geographical location of these Maristans, like in where they were, because they were centrally located, like with the madaris of the masajid. And I think one thing that we don't think of today, and what you talk about also in the book, is this motivation about treating the destitute, the poor, sick. Nowadays, our hospitals, like poor and rich people go to the same hospital, but there's some differences there. Obviously, like some of the rich people get a little bit better, but
Stanford, we call it the red blanket.
right. But certainly at that time, a lot of physicians, they would go to the home. So if you were well off, they would
you would just have the doctor visit you at home.
Exactly,
yes,
but that was not something that was available for the poor, and so it's beautiful to see this impulse is really driven particularly for treatment of poor, sick patients.
Yes, in its original form, even though it treated everybody. And we do have narrations that talk about how there are those who are wealthy even being treated, because the system, the care given in it was so high quality that there was almost like a sense of, we even have stories, subhanAllah, we translated some of these into our book, of people faking illness to go in because the food was so good and that the staff knew that they were faking. So they actually, imagine this, they actually had written into the rules a rule that said, if somebody comes in as a visitor that's not actually ill, we'll give them 3 days.
Okay.
Right. Wow. So they'll feed them for 3 days, and
like the standard custom.
Yeah, the custom, the little kind of like hospitality. But then they'll say the 3 days are up, you have to go now. And who would want? I mean, I can't imagine anybody wanting to put themselves, check themselves into a hospital today, like with all hospital food is considered to be terrible food, and it's supposed to be a place that heals you, subhanAllah. So this is a far cry from that.
Now, if we could delve a little bit into the modes of treatment. You describe antiquity, there was a certain way of understanding illness and how to treat illness. But you talk about this, if I could get this right, a biopsychosocial spiritual framework.
That's right.
If you could expand on that, please.
Yeah. And many people in the health professions, they've learned the biopsychosocial model. So biological meaning, think about genetics, think about hormones, think about neurotransmitters, right? Biological aspects. The social is what it sounds like: environmental, family, the way you were brought up and where you were brought up and so on. Was it in time of famine, war, peace? What was it? And then, psycho, meaning here the psychological aspect of it. So you have, thinking about, as a person has, some people are just from the way the family raised them and nurture and nature, the way Allah gave them, they have resilience, and others not so much. The spiritual piece is that piece that's always missing from this model. And it's almost like, because it's so secular, right? So it's kind of taking away, especially people of faith, people that are God-centered, they draw so much support from their spiritual teachings, coping mechanisms, sabr, right? Patience, tawakkul, relying on Allah. There's all these concepts that not just Muslims, other people of faith too draw from. And if you kind of just X that out completely, you're missing a whole way of healing that people actually use that is very beneficial to them. So we propose this biopsychosocial spiritual model to make sure that we're addressing mind, body, soul, the Islamic concept of healing yourself inside and out all the way through.
And so this includes diet, for example.
Yes, absolutely.
It includes the spiritual counseling, or this. It's really amazing that in some of these Maristans, like there was people assigned. Mm-hmm. Like almost like not a companion, I guess.
Yes, the companions. Yes,
in modern day hospitals, they don't have. They just have someone who sits because someone's dangerous for themselves. Like it's not like, but they're not actually. These people were actually supporting them. It was like a friend.
Yes, the murafiq. Yes, right, exactly. Right. That's exactly what they are, and they're meant to be these companions that kind of assist and help, so people aren't lonely, isolated, feeling alone, and so on.
So incorporating all of this, so you have diet, you have medicine, you have these companionship, you have the spiritual healing, but then you also have these other elements like sounds, right?
Absolutely. This is where the different forms of therapies are in place, and this is so beautiful. The best way to explain this is think about if we're going to heal mind, body, soul, we're going to need to look at all 5 senses, right? And this is exactly what they did. So the people they hired as healers, again, in addition to the doctor and so on, you also have people who are doing other forms of therapy, such as, think about the ears and sound therapy, or some people may call it music therapy. Mm-hmm. They actually hired orchestras. This is so amazing to us. We have a paper written on this. And sometimes people get upset with me and they're like, music, no, haram, hold on. I'm like, wait. This is medicalized music therapy, as in to say it's not for entertainment. Mm-hmm. They took it from the Greeks, right? Because they inherited so much knowledge from the Greeks, kind of filtered out what was useful in the early years of Islam, kind of Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, all this work they were doing to translate the works of the Greeks. And so you take a look at someone as Farabi, he takes the maqamat, the tones, the science of the tones from the Greeks. And he says, okay, we're not going to do this for entertainment purposes the way the Greeks did this. We're going to do this with medicalized, right? So the next group after him says, okay, this tone here, when you play it, it actually relaxes a very anxious person. This other tone here, when you play it, it actually brings up the mood of a depressed person. So just like they customize diet within this Maristan for people's eating and healing, they also customize sound therapy for different people, play for their specific conditions. And they had full-on orchestras hired for this, right? That's amazing. That's sound. That's not even touching now, sight. So think about color. And they had a whole idea of like color therapy. This was all different sciences that they studied, in addition to the place where they are. So the architecture of the building itself is so healing. It's beautiful because Islamic architecture is so beautiful, but the geometry of it all is so exquisite. And it's done in a way, this is pre-modern, so there's no microphones, right? So basically there's, how do you, from where you are in your patient room, able to hear the orchestra, or how are you able to hear the adhan? So just even the acoustics of the place, plus the privacy. The fountains in the middle of there's a trademark of fountains in every one of these. There's fountains. Yeah. And the sound of water all through the day kind of playing is in itself healing, as is the water therapy itself, the hydrotherapy, which they also put in place. And you're looking at also sound therapy, color therapy, aromatherapy, so the scent. So they, again, what they grew in their orchards had a lot of, we read a lot about basil, for example, because it has such a beautiful smell, jasmine, some of the other things that they used medicinally, and also just to make it beautiful and fragrant.
So these are all elements that I don't think any of us would connote with any modern day hospital.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I'm just listening to it right now, thinking what a sight that must have been. What an experience that must have been, both for the patient and even the workers, the people who are there. Imagine coming into a workplace environment as one of the sound, the sight, the colors, the smell, all tuned to
the greenery.
Yeah.
They were so intentional about these things.
Incredible.
And that's not even getting to the cognitive part or the physical part, because the physical part is exercise, and that was built in. And the cognitive part, talk therapy. That's where people are always like floored. They're like, what do you mean? I say, this is not a Western or a quote white thing. This is something that existed with the Muslims. I won't say they were the first to start talk therapies, because we see it in some of the civilizations before them, but they absolutely leveraged the concept of talk therapy as one of the ways of healing. Balkhi writes about this, right? In his writings, or when I was writing about OCD and Balkhi, I was mentioning how in his criteria of healing, how do you treat this? He talks about, you must talk to somebody who's guided to guide you, who has trained in how to speak to you for this condition.
And what's really interesting about that, Dr. Rania, is today there are studies now that actually from earlier this year at the Harvard Business School that the number one reason people are using things like ChatGPT or Gemini and these things is for therapy and counseling.
Yes,
so they're actually, they're hurting, and they're looking for solace from that hurting. They're not finding it in human beings, and they're going to robots or to AI to try and discover that. It's really, I think, telling about, where we are as a community and society, and then also where people are still looking for this.
That's right.
They're very much looking for, how do we heal from these things?
Yes, and it comes with its dangers. Unfortunately, the AI world they're not humans. Right, at the
they're not trained. To your point, they're not trained. There were people who were trained for this talk therapy, right?
That's right. That's absolutely right.
I sort of when you were mentioning how some people would just sort of crash the Maristan just to get food.
Yes.
But how it's been described, and you go further in details of the book about it, but it does seem like a place like you just want to visit. Maybe it's a bad commentary of our modern condition that this is like we actually want to go to a hospital, from then. But it does seem quite amazing, and I have to say, I want to spend a little time about the architecture standpoint, because I think as Muslims, we're in awe and we appreciate the Islamic architecture so much, especially in the masajid. But there's elements that are described in the architectural component of this book that made me appreciate Islamic architecture as a whole in a way that I never really understood before. And that is particularly how it speaks to the soul.
Yes.
And one of the ways it's beautifully mentioned in the book was that, this is not just a space of healing. The base itself is healing.
That's right. That's right.
And so I if we could explore a little bit about one, just sort of some of the you mentioned the courtyards and water fountain, a little bit more about some of the functional components of it, but also just the meaning of, the meaning of symbols, what that means for one's fitrah, one's soul.
Yes, absolutely. And you're absolutely right. This is not just a healing center, a place to go heal. This is maybe I'll mention this in a few minutes about, in thinking about how to revive this in the modern era, because people can say, oh, why don't, come here. We have this building, make it Maristan. It's like, no. This is one of those things you build from the ground up with intentionality. You can't just go into an already built space. You actually have to build it for healing, right? And so you were talking about some of the symbols and some of the fitrah-based aspects. And I think about, in some of when we came to write this book, I took a short sabbatical across Turkey, kind of visiting all the different Maristans that are standing today. And in almost all of them, it's very interesting. You get some of these doorways that are very short. And you're like, what? Why? They couldn't have been this short. It can't be that we got this much taller, right? In these years intervening. But it wasn't that. They actually built them this way because the concept was if you are ailing and you're hurting, there's a certain amount of humility that has to come with, I need help, right? And there's a certain turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that help and assistance, as well as the others Allah has put in your place to help you heal, the healers. So they'd actually have these doorways where you literally have to kind of almost bend and duck almost. And you're going, and it symbolizes going from a place of difficulty and darkness. And then you open up into an open courtyard that's sunny and beautiful and, amazing. And just that motion, right, kind of is a physical, it's a connecting, right? Mind, body, soul connection, kind of a physical and cognitive and emotional reminder that we are indebted to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gives us illness and health, right? Ya Shafi, right? Like this concept. And so there's a opening of one's chest is how they describe it. Once you go into the open courtyard and space and realizing you're going to get through this. Like there is light at the end of that tunnel, right?
Yeah. It's again, the intentionality of this and, several things which you've already described. A lot of these things, remind me of spiritual treatments in sense of for example, like you mentioned the tonal therapies, musical therapies. I was thinking maybe there's certain adhkar that you say that when someone is too, they can get really too hot and there's cold.
Of course.
And I wonder if this is a direct inspiration or for example, this companion who's helping in your treatment, you need good companionship to help you in your spiritual heart, right? Same thing with how this architecture is very directly intentional in terms of how, the soul is on a journey as it tries to heal the body together.
That's right.
So, you describe how, the entrance of these Maristans, there's two levels. So there's a larger level, which is very welcoming, but then it's also a smaller doorway to enter. So it's not as if it's too expansive because you don't want to feel so small, right? But then even how they made corridors, they made these corridors after you enter to almost detoxify and to differentiate this realm from the healing realm.
If people are really interested in this topic further, one of my mentors, and who's just one of the most amazing people out there, mashallah, has written a very important book. This is Sheikh Dr. Mustafa al-Badawi. Okay. And he's written a very beautiful book on the spiritual significance of Islamic architecture. So he's also, I guess, similarly a psychiatrist, and of course he's a sheikh as well. And so you have the combination coming in, and he took a special interest in the concept of Islamic architecture as healing, like it itself. So he talks about in the modern era, we've lost this science altogether. Even when we build our masajid today, he said to me, Rania, you sometimes people don't even, historically, the place in which they would put the hilal, right, the crescent on top of the minaret would tell you the direction of prayer. So if you're from far away and needing to know which way the qibla was, you could just look at the minaret and know. He's like, today people don't know. They just put this way. They're not even paying attention. He's like, they've lost the science behind the spiritual significance of all the architecture. Excellent book.
On all this is again it's a reminder of I would say the unseen reality, right?
That's right.
Again, I personally didn't really appreciate this. When you go to these beautiful spaces, you think of it on a very superficial level, but it is like speaking to your soul.
That's right.
And I don't really appreciate. And so it even goes to the incorporation of nature, as you said, the water fountain, having what we call now biophilic, design, this incorporation of like shrubbery and nature. And I just keep on thinking of where we are today in terms of the modern hospital today. It's devoid of anything of that. So how can it even, begin to heal
honestly,
us?
it's not even the patients. I would say as a physician, when I walk into the hospital, it is, and Stanford Hospital is one of the most, just amazing hospitals in the world, but it's like the beeping sounds, the white sterile walls, just the things that are, it's so
artificial lighting.
Yes.
And
Yes, definitely. And then you just feel, I feel like I leave less healed than when I probably shouldn't say that. I probably shouldn't say that. Alhamdulillah. But truly, and so I feel very strongly, and I often do not translate the word Maristan as hospital. I really intentionally call it healing center for this reason, because I think in the English language, when people hear hospital, there's a connotation of something else that's not very healing and kind of a scary space almost. And I don't want to go there. We meet so many people that don't want to go to the doctor, don't want to go to the hospital, even if they have to. But if you think about it more of a healing space, and this is our hopes in kind of reviving and building the modern Maristan today, inshallah ta'ala, is actually to make it something that is truly healing and something you actually want to go and get that support and care from.
And, it's interesting you mentioned about practitioners, like the physicians, all the staff that are working in these Maristans. I thought it was very important point about. Actually, we didn't call it Islamic psychology, which is something that is undercurrent throughout the book. It's about this holistic model of healing, right? One of the important points that I thought I'd like to explore a little bit here was the role of the provider in the success of the treatment. And specifically, it's not just only about their clinical acumen, understanding how to treat the disease, but it actually goes back to who they are.
That's right.
And absolutely. How they are, what they're like, the ikhlas in their attention, the ihsaan and practices you described.
That's absolutely right. In fact, when I'm doing training for Islamic psychology, my own clinicians within the Maristan, the nonprofit, the current Maristan nonprofit, and the clinicians that are practicing within, I train them in Islamic psychology principles. And one of the main things that we talk about is this is not theory. This is in addition to the theory and the clinical practices, there's your own personal practice and your place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you cannot be a true Islamic psychologist if you yourself are distant from Allah and are devoid from those spiritual practices, which is hard because people will say, oh, it'd be great. I'd love to work in this space. And people come to me all the time. How do I become an Islamic psychologist? And my answer always is, in addition to getting your licenses and credentialing to practice in America, here in the United States here, those are the rules. You have to study Islam and you have to devote yourself to the study of Islam and to the spiritual sciences. Otherwise, look, as an Islamic psychologist, if you come to me and say, this is something that I'm coming to specifically for Islamic psychology, not just, because you could have seen any other psychiatrist or any other therapist. If you're coming to me and saying Islamic psychology, then my goal, in addition to all the things, we can talk depression, anxiety, trauma, OCD, whatever it may be, whatever diagnosis you have clinically or not even formally diagnosed, just dealing with stress and so on. Ultimately, my goal is to not just symptom reduction, not just kind of reduce your symptoms, because that would be sufficient as a modern day psychiatrist. Did my job, right? But as an Islamic psychologist, my job is to orient you back to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of you in this dunya. So kind of that fitrah state, right? That primordial essence Allah created you on, and the purpose you're here, and to get you to Jannah.
Right.
Because if all that I do for you and I reduce your, let's say, depression symptoms, and now you're out driving your red Corvette. I don't know why I always say red Corvette, but I do. And you're out there driving it and you're doing this and that. But ultimately your end place is the hellfire, then I haven't done my job.
Right.
That's not the point of Islamic psychology. There's a much higher transcendence into actually what we're doing in terms of making sure that the interpersonal issues people have in their families, the traumas they've experienced and so on, help integrate them back into a life process that eventually ends up in Jannah and the Akhirah.
It's very corrective, right? It's very, like, the healing itself is not meant to just take care of the symptoms.
That's right.
We're going to make this a corrective practice for the individual so that they're much better off in not just this world, but the next.
Absolutely.
But again, also, this is a really powerful point about the provider, the treating physician, because I don't think I would say the majority of physicians don't consider their own behavioral practice, their own relationship with their families, their own relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yes, they see like maybe the believing ones, they see like, yes, this is a noble thing and this I'm treating the sick and all that, but they don't think that who I am inside is really actually going to affect the efficacy of the treatment, which I think is really, I mean, you describe some of the recommended practices of like, doing wudu and like making dhikr and praying before a patient encounter. And there's this beautiful, again, connecting with the Prophet ﷺ about the hadith about, the mirrors a believer to another believer.
That's right.
But using that in this relationship, like that is beautiful to consider the patient as a mirror of yourself. Because not only are you humanizing them, because you're seeing that could be me.
Yeah, absolutely.
That could be me, and that is me, because we're mirrors to each other. We see the faults and the beauty in each other, right? So that it's this profound, actually, spiritual relationship, Sheikha, between the provider, the treatment team, and the patient.
Absolutely. I once asked one of my spiritual teachers and said, "Look, in my line of work, I have session after session after session all day long. And each session is heavier, just all day long. What do you advise?" And she said, do you do your dhikr in between? I said, it's like one patient after, there's no time in between. She said, you have to just pause and make sure you read at least the mu'awwadat, at least the Fatiha. You've got to do something just to cleanse spiritually between each person and the next, between each session and the next. Those little nuances, they sound little, but they're massive. Do you know what I mean? Because then we know physician burnout is a real thing. Yeah. Any healer, any of the healing professions, burnout is massively a real thing. And then you have somebody who's literally running on empty themselves, trying to heal someone else.
Right.
Doesn't work.
Right.
Doesn't work well. And this is, all the stats are there about how many physicians are on alcohol and drug use. And so, it's, unfortunately, suicide and rates are really high in healing professions. And I believe a lot of this has to do with, looking at it very intellectualizing it all. Like, this is my job. These are my credentials. Here are my degrees on the wall. I have this knowledge, not realizing that the shafi is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yeah. And you're just the vehicle through which that shifat travels. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So it's a humbling kind of experience.
For a lot of our listeners hearing this historical phenomenon wide across time and space in the Muslim world of the Maristan, right? Mental health was seen in the same level as physical illness. There wasn't a stigmatization. It was seen as just illness. So people would, and myself included, would say, okay, well, what happened? Because there's a lot of stigmatization in a lot of our Muslim cultures across the world. And so how did it come from this place where even people would want to crash to go, these type of places of healing, to where we became, in the last 100, 150 years of where mental illness is not treated like physical illness. Like you can't go out and say, if I have a chronic illness, like say heart disease, diabetes, maybe cancer or something like that, people, you can say that freely, if and it's not, doesn't have the stigma. People will understand like, oh, okay, but you can't go freely and talk about mental illness. So there's a stigmatization there. Where did that come from? Where do you think that came from?
That's like the famous question, right? MashaAllah. There's a number of reasons, and not to go into like all the like depth of it, but just a couple of main reasons. And I always say like it's really important that we point the finger at ourselves first before pointing it outside, because there were external forces that I'll speak to in just in a moment. But internally, within the Muslim lands and Muslim communities, these institutions that we're talking about, these healing centers, were all done with the Awqaf, right? Endowments, these pious endowments, and when you see the downfall of them, and when you see where it starts going from these literally like almost like beautiful garden, amazing, somebody said to me, Jannah-like. I was like, okay, maybe not to that extent, but, mashallah, beautiful, services towards the end of their lives, the Maristans, you could see that there was, a going backwards, and the roots of so much of that was misuse of the funds. Because if a waqf is for Allah, so if a person starts to pocket that money or use it incorrectly or do, where it wasn't intended for, then you have no money going into this anymore. And a lot of times there was centuries worth of funds because it was invested, right, in the orchards and the bazaars and so whatever it is, the hammam that was there. And eventually they became kulliyas, which means complexes. So you had, soup kitchen and masjid and madrasa and medicine all in the same place. And the misuse of funds eventually make it become something that looks more like an asylum, where people look like it's more like a jailhouse than it is a treatment center, healing center. And so that's one of the first main issues that happen. One of the second massive issues we have to acknowledge is so many of the Muslim majority lands became colonized. And the colonization, unfortunately, wasn't just a colonization of land, but it was a colonization of people's minds too. And I think that's the colonization that's still happening today. Yeah. Even if they've left our lands, our minds are still colonized, to be honest. And what happens there? Well, when you're colonized by a victor and they're your superior and you're inferior, they're bringing all of their concepts into your countries and replacing those ideas. So all the indigenous forms of healing go by the wayside. This is looked as something backwards almost. And new medicine and science and hospitals, right, are replacing it. But unfortunately, those systems come with their own biases.
Right.
And the bias of mental health that comes from Europe, and a lot of the European colonization is really where it mostly comes from, was so backwards compared to mental health.
Yeah.
Because
it's not God-centric.
It's not God-centric. Yeah. It's secularized. And even before it was secularized, it was still seen as something supernatural, not scientific. So in the same era we're describing all this happening in the Muslim civilization, in Europe, you have one of two options. If you have a mental illness, you're either sent to the nuns and priests as like a religious, spiritual issue. This is something not to treat you medically, but rather just to house you, to feed you, but they're just housing, right? They're not really treating. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, you hear of these cases of people burned as witches at the stake, right? As just being treated horribly because they didn't know what to do with them. And a lot of that bias then comes into the Muslim lands with the colonial powers that come in. And so you see asylums start to show up in our countries, Muslim countries, because that's what they had in Europe, out of sight, out of mind. Whereas these Maristans were actually at the center of town. So you can fulfill the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ of visiting the marid, visiting the ill. It's always at the center of town, accessible. Financially, no one's, that you go in, you don't have to pay a single thing because it's all covered by the endowment. And accessible and right there available for all. The asylums are out of sight, out of mind. We want to rid our society from seeing people who are not well like this. And that is unfortunately how a lot of the mental health treatment gets replaced.
Just one string I'd like to pull on the colonization of the minds. It's really interesting. Karen Armstrong, she wrote a book called Islam, A Short History. And she actually in that book mentions that for about the 90 or so years that the Crusaders were in charge of Jerusalem. Where they had after the first Crusades and had taken over that time period. She's like, if you read the Muslim writings from that time, the colonized always felt that they were superior in civilization and culture. Yes. So they never took on that mantra of, hey, these people have won, and so therefore they are better than us. And she said that was why within a generation you had kind of a total flip of what the situation was. Whereas with colonization, what happened was, hey, there's this, these people must be better. Their systems must be better. What they've produced must be better. And that colonization is something we're still still
see it today.
To this day.
And best, West is best, right? This kind of thing. People have actually asked me, when you come to build the first Maristan in the modern world, where will you build it? And I said, right here in America. And they said, why? I said, because the way our minds are still, unfortunately, the way it still is, West is best. And somehow I believe, subhanAllah, it happens with my lab, like the Muslim Mental Health and Islamic Psychology lab. It's the first one, right? It might be in the world, I don't know, but definitely in America. And I had a colleague of mine who was trying to do something similar in Turkey. And, this is like, the Dada Shifas are still standing in Turkey, right? They're still there. And they told him at the university, they told him, absolutely not. You cannot call anything or put on the wall something called Islamic psychology. And he literally said, but Stanford has it. And he pulls up the website and shows them my lab's website with Islamic psychology on it. And they're like, oh, wow. If Stanford is doing it. And it's just the most ridiculous thing. Yeah. And so for better or for worse, inshallah, we start here and we hope to scale and then see a ripple effect happen.
And there is, Dr. Rania, there's a huge need here, as we know, right? So not to say that there's not a need elsewhere in the world and all over the world. But yeah, absolutely. There's so much of this. There's not a lot of healing that happens in terms of the senses, the way that you've been talking about. It's very kind of, here's a symptom, let's treat that symptom, not really looking at the whole individual.
Right. There's, as detailed, I mean, you've already mentioned Sheikha several times, like all senses are engaged in this type of healing. I mean, from the linens that you have, from what goes in your mouth, to the sounds you hear, like water, natural sounds, what you see. We talked about this beauty in the architecture, this spacious and natural things. It's quite amazing. I want to ask about, in terms of Islamic psychology, we talked about there's a spiritual framework to it. We spoke about, some of the recommendations about praying and instituting that as part of, your treatment approach. But that obviously, where we live, that could be quite controversial, especially in modern medicine, to try to. And I may be wrong, but I would think there might be some concern from people who are very secular minded that to introduce this type of religiosity into treatment.
Yes and no. When I was first coming into the field, I would say absolutely there was really very little wiggle room to do anything like this. But I really do feel that the field of psychology, psychiatry itself is starting to shift.
Okay.
There's a whole subfield of psychology today called RNS, Religion and Spirituality in Psychiatry and Psychology. And I have a whole group of colleagues that I'm connected to. Our lab is the Muslim lab amongst them, but who are coming from the Christian psychology, Jewish psychology, Buddhist, Hindu psychology spaces. And they're all doing something very similar, just like we're doing Islamic psychology kind of revival. They're doing something similar with their faith backgrounds too. And because there's just more room for, again, these alternative concepts of healing that are needed, again, people are trying to secularize them. Like I think about in my field of mental health around, mindfulness and, meditation, right? But, it's mindfulness meditation. It comes from a religious source to begin with. It's coming from the Buddhist tradition, but secularized. Right. And there's a whole lot of benefit, a lot of evidence-based, research and practice around this, that it actually works. I'm not going to deny that. But just like they were able to take something from a different tradition, granted it may be misappropriating it, honestly, I do feel that if you were to say from the Islamic tradition, here's how to help a Muslim patient or client. Here are the dhikr practices. Here are the spiritual practices that aid them. No, not much different than your mindfulness meditation or yoga or whatever it may be from the Buddhist or Hindu traditions. Yoga is from the Hindu tradition, right? But somehow they're incorporating these concepts in to mainstream psychology and psychiatry today. So yes and no.
Okay. Yeah. And as a pointer, just for my own clarification, this holistic model, I mean, historically, all these techniques, what we might call alternative therapies today, were those all part of the primary treatment? Because currently now these alternative treatments, I think there's a different term now used, but they're sort of like if this doesn't work, the medicine doesn't work, then you can go to acupuncture, you can go to this and that. But was the Maristan, was that actually all from the very beginning?
Yes, those were the core treatments, as in to say the treatments in and of themselves were holistic. It wasn't seen as these pills or this treatment that you take by mouth, whether they be pills or syrup or whatever you're taking, medication wise, was better than the talk therapies or the aromatherapies. They really were more on equal footing.
Okay. Okay.
And that's different from today's situation where pharmacy and polypharmacy is seen as something that's somehow, higher up on the chain.
But as you say, there seems to be some, it sounds like there's some shifts going on in the field of psychiatry.
Yes, I believe
that's reconsidering, heavy, psychopharmacology and just restricting themselves just to that. Or just heavy psychotherapy. There's some development going on.
Absolutely. The interest in non-invasive treatments. So I think about things like TMS, for example, transmagnetic stimulation, because there's no medication with it, and there's no actual. You don't need to go under anesthesia the way you might have to for ECT and so on. There's electrical convulsive therapies. So all the non-invasive procedures are becoming much more on kind of the cutting edge of where the field is going. And then you think about all of the really promoting different forms of talk therapy. When I first entered the field, there was so much more interest in just CBT, cognitive behavioral therapies. And now there's all these other forms of therapies that are emerging that are people, because they're also testing them and finding efficacy. So now it's evidence-based too, right? You can't really push and say, well, that wasn't useful. It is. right? There's science behind it now. And I think that's going to be the most important thing is where we need to, in the Islamic psychology field, bring this to a, quote, scientific area. All we really have to do is be able to show that it's working scientifically and validate it. And if that's the case, because we know anecdotally it's working, but now we have to show that actually in the science itself as well, which is some of the work my lab is doing, right, to make sure it actually reaches a point of evidence base. What
are the first steps or what are the next steps in terms of having a rooted revival of this Maristan tradition?
Yes, I love that rooted revival. That's Dr. Rajab Shanturk's terminology there. MashaAllah. It's so important. When I think about what that looks like, first, and this is what we've been doing with the book actually, and talking about this is number one is really elevating global consciousness, as in to say, most people that I spoke to, even in the psychology and psychiatry spaces, even in, the field of history, like they just didn't have the concept of the Maristan. Because I thought it was just me. I was like, maybe I didn't ever heard about it. Right? No, it turns out truly that people are like, what's a Maristan? Right. And it was really interesting to me because as soon as I would say, what about Dada Shifat so-and-so? Like, oh yeah, of course. But they never made the connection that this was so intrinsically part of the Islamic heritage and civilization, nor especially the part about the Muslims being the first really bringing medicalized psychiatric care into their hospital or healing center treatments, right? That was really unique and different. So really the global consciousness is the first thing, which I appreciate being able to talk about this on your podcast for that reason. Number two, I would say, once you're able to really raise that consciousness, now there's a change of mindset, of really saying, okay, maybe we need these institutions. How do we go about doing so? So for the last several years, we were building out the blueprint. So the book is part of the blueprint. It actually, there's the last chapter talks about the blueprint in the modern era, what that might look like. And there it's talking about two levels. You have the actual building and structure, the architecture part of it, which alhamdulillah, we've actually drawn out a rendition of what this could look like. Oh, nice. But the main thing that's going to come is actually two more things, which is the funding. That's a huge one. Of course. Right. We're talking about something that's on the order of millions of dollars in the modern day to really build out something so beautiful and actually fitting the Islamic healing principles, as we discussed architecturally. And secondly, even more important than the building itself are the people, the healers. Sure. So training the next generation of healers that see themselves as people who are helping, and they can come from all different disciplines. They could be pharmacists, physicians, dietitians, therapists, all different forms of healers. But the main thing that brings them all together is knowing that they're doing this not only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they are the vehicle through which His shifa travels. And so you can't be that vehicle if you yourself aren't healed yourself and working through healing yourself. And we're all we're all wounded healers, so to say. We all have our own injuries along the way. However, it's the framework and the mindset shift that needs to happen. So we're currently training a whole group of healers, alhamdulillah, who are hoping to go into Islamic psychology from its, entering it from different aspects, whether they be actual psychologists or whether they be the dietitian, pharmacists and nurses and so on. So that's, those are kind of the main next steps that have to happen here.
Yeah. Allah give you tawfiq. That's amazing work. And I think it's very much needed. And I'm actually hearing this, I'm very hopeful for the next generation and for what we might be able to provide, not just to Muslims, but to society, based on our own tradition.
Yeah, Rab, me too. I mean, I'll share this much. Almost 4 years ago now, we founded a nonprofit organization and actually called it Maristan in the name of this, concept. And that's exactly what it's doing. It's doing a lot of the education, a lot of the raising global consciousness. We've been doing that for 3 years. And now the clinicians that are within this organization are being trained, as I'm mentioning. Of course, it's all based in California at the moment, but I figured, if anyone's going to accept alternative anything, it's probably California.
Love it.
So we're going to start there first, inshallah. But I guess this is a good call to just sort of say to those who might be listening and find themselves inspired or interested, to please reach out. I feel there's skill sets of all sorts, not just clinical, but people who are, who are financially savvy and know how to sort that out. Architects, people who are interested in design work. I mean, these are things that are very specific and different skill sets to actually bring a very multidisciplinary, healing center like this to existence.
I mean, obviously, certain funding is a major issue, right? And one thing that I think we neglected to explore was some of the details of the Awqaf. But one interesting thing was, I think, was that these were private endowments, right?
Yes.
And how it alleviated the strain on the state.
That's right.
To provide the service.
That's right.
And this is still an issue now. Whether wherever you are in the world, there's still a major strain. So obviously, funding is a major need for reviving this type of institution. But as a final point, what are other things that the greater community can do to help support this revival?
Yeah, mashallah. I mean, look, number one, absolutely is dua. There's nothing, no success comes except from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I feel that the more people who make dua, the more likely this will happen, inshallah. And that doesn't cost anything, inshallah. Just you making dua for us is worth every bit to us. I do want to make a point though about the endowments, and sometimes people think of endowments and they're thinking huge amounts of sums of money. And it's true that some of the, Maristans that we know historically were in fact fully endowed by like one person.
Mm-hmm.
This was there and literally in the waqfiyah, which is the waqf document that writes everything out. You literally read, and this is inshallah my ticket to heaven, ticket to Jannah. Like they're like, I'm doing this with the hopes to get to Jannah. But sometimes there were multiple people actually doing this together. And that's where I'd like to call on our community and say, if you feel inspired in this way and you're looking to put an endowment of yours into something as a sadaqah jariyah, right, ongoing charity after you're long gone, this is what our early predecessors would do. They would actually literally say, and we pray this will be my sadaqah. This is what I'm leaving on earth after I'm long and gone and buried, right? This continues to reap its benefit. And those Maristans were around for centuries. So if you can imagine how much benefit came to them, inshallah ta'ala, we hope. So, so the third thing I would just say to our general community too is, support. Yeah. It's the most beautiful thing when you find people who say, look, I don't have the funds right now, or I don't have, but what I do have is that I've had a few architects come up and be like, we'll draw up the rendition. And I'm like, alhamdulillah, like whatever skill set comes, you have potentially. Somebody came to me and said, branding, I can do the branding. I said, alhamdulillah, there's so many skill sets here. But mostly it's just knowing that it's going to, like they say, it takes a village, right?
Right.
To raise a child, and it takes a village to raise a Maristan, clearly, inshallah. So that's my hope.
Well, thank you so much, Sheikha, for joining us today to really open our minds about this a topic which is, is misunderstood, and also a history that we want to revive and I honestly take pride in. I think this is something that all of us should know. I mean, alhamdulillah, it's beautiful to hear this tradition, and may Allah increase for you and bring success to this initiative and make us all vehicles to help you in that. So I thank you again for joining us, Shad. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Salim. And Sheikh Rania, this was amazing. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Alhamdulillah.
And to all our listeners, again, thank you for joining us today. If you found benefit in this discussion we had today, please share it with friends, family, anyone you think may take benefit from it. And until then, we'll see you in the next program. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto you.